We can kick this off. This can also, it's a late night for Juan. We had a lot of fun with this the last time. So we're going to walk you through our view of kind of the intro to SSI ecosystem. And please raise your hand. We'll be monitoring the thread, and we'd rather have a fun conversation instead of just go through the presentation. So stop us with questions.
Absolutely.
Cool. So if you'll hop to the next slide, we can just both introduce ourselves. Juan, you want to go first, and then I'll take us through the next slide?
Sure. My name is Juan Caballero. I've been in the SSI space, I don't know, 4 or 5 years. And a lot of the materials linked here were part of a education contract with DIF. And I advise a lot of startups, all of which I think are DIF members, listed there. And you can find me on Twitter or email me. That is me.
Awesome. And I'm Karyl Fowler. I'm CEO and co-founder of a company called Transmute. You might have seen some of my other colleagues at different sessions or presenting. We use SSI-based technologies in the logistics space, in particular, to manage certain parts of global trade and infuse some trust and security into some of those workflows. We're based in Austin, Texas. You can find me at the info listed here. And we are your guides through the intro to SSI.
May God have mercy on your soul.
So when we were putting this together last time, we realized that there's some contextualization that I think is worthy of noting up front. So this term is tossed around at this conference and kind of in the broader digital identity ecosystem. And a lot of folks wonder kind of what is SSI, because I think we talk about it with 2 different frames. And so for the rest of Juan and I's presentation, we'll be dividing the presentation into these 2 parts. So self-sovereign identity is really kind of falls into two buckets. One is the movement, or kind of the philosophy behind or entailed in the self-sovereign identity industry. And the other is the technologies that power generally applications that achieve some qualities or values involved in the broader philosophy and the movement. And with that, Juan's going to take you through the philosophy, and then I'll take you through some of the tech.
Sure. Okay. So you may notice that there's a lot of these blue underlined things that the kids are calling web links. And at the end, you'll get a link to this presentation in PDF form, so you can just click all the links if you're want to share this around. It's meant to be web linked. And in 2005, when people were talking a lot about web links and this Web 2 business and its miscontents, some of the articles here that get pointed to the most as definitive sort of scriptural explanations of what self-sovereignty is, or what self-sovereign identity is, or how to decentralize the identity system inherited from earlier modes of web technology and software. These are usually the names and the texts. So Kim Cameron, I believe at the time he was with Microsoft already, wrote Laws of Identity that spawned like a discussion group along email, sort of organic community that became this conference. Doc Kaliya and Phil Windley have been running it ever since, twice a year, and we're here thanks to their the warm community they've made and the space they make in it for weirdos like me and Karyl. Yeah, so the laws of identity were 7 laws. Doc, Kaliya, and Phil are all avid bloggers to this day, right? An essay a month in various places that are very useful no matter where you are in the learning curve with any of this stuff. And the 10 principles, expanding on Kim Cameron's 7 principles, little more recent, get discussed a lot at a sort of white paper generating more technical conference called the Rebooting Web of Trust, which is on a bit of a hiatus at the moment, but will hopefully rise like a phoenix from the ashes of COVID. Yeah, those are names and links. This slide is my pride and joy. I spent a week on it earlier this year. And I like to think of decentralized identity as a sweet spot between some bigger currents and contemporary thinking about what Web3 and Web4 and whatever comes after the web. In Europe, there's this great program called the Next Generation Internet, which is a big bunch of temporary think tanks and accelerators and hackathons. So I like to think of the decentralized identity community as this confluence of people trying to innovate business practices and the business model of IT and the business applications of IT. That would be the blue circle there. A lot of people in the more experimental governance end of the blockchain spectrum, I would put there very much in the token engineering, incentive engineering camp. The DAO people are over there. The yellow circle, I think there are a lot of people trying to do cool things with data that is private. So private data and data governance beyond just the individual government binary is great. I think in North America, in the tech industry in Silicon Valley, there's this legacy, maybe some people call it the California ideology, when they're writing academic monographs about what's wrong with us, tend to talk about how America can only conceive of like the individual scale and the government. Like the private sector is never seen as a potentially nefarious party. It's always like we have to trust, it's either Facebook or China. We either trust private sector or an evil government takes over. But I'm a huge fan of more granular, complicated maps of power and not trusting the private sector magically. So yeah, the yellow circle is a big one. And the red circle, I think, is often a little more individualistic, thinking about the rights of the individual vis-a-vis everyone else who touches their data. The right to repair movement is pretty strong. I mean, if you follow like Cory Doctorow or those kind of thinkers, there's a lot of work on subverting the business models of IP and or expanding the spectrum of licensure to include locked open source and that kind of thing. So data sovereignty takes you in some pretty interesting directions. The holochain people I would put over here because they are, they made a open source license so controversial. One of the board members of the open source initiative resigned over it. He's like, this is too weird for me. So yeah, there's a lot of places you can go, and I hope the reason I devote so much of my time to SSI is that I think it has something to bring to all three of these movements. I think it can be useful in all these contexts, and hopefully if we do it right, it will get the best of all three built into the next generation internet. That's my story and I'm sticking to it. Another thing to know if you're just wading into these heady ideological waters for the first time, particularly if you're coming from the blockchain space or government procurement IT, if you're used to thinking about the nitty-gritty of regulation and the spirit of the law and that kind of stuff, you might see some people maybe over dramatize this distinction or make it too binary. I don't think many of the thinkers or companies pushing the envelope of SSI are completely pro-government or total nihilist libertarians, but there is a sort of spectrum from more trust minimized identity, or identity that, you know, a lot of people talk about global citizenship or the internet being outside the reach or domain of the state, or at least of the nation state, and censorship resistance, PGP, web of trust, encryption activism. These are the people that would like the internet not to be beholden to deep states are over at that end of the spectrum. And there are governments investing heavily in decentralized identity, more now than 6 months ago, more now than 12 months ago. And governments don't necessarily, or at least every branch of every government does not want as much data as possible on citizens. Plenty of governments, I believe them when they say they want less data, and they want to, render unto Caesar and have data minimization in every function of government, so that, you know, the post office doesn't know about your tax records, and the tax authority doesn't necessarily have total insight into every aspect of your financial life. And the legally enabled self-sovereign folks who are working on shifting the legal framework for IT are, I think, doing some really interesting work. IIW is not exactly a policy conference, but there are plenty of policy conferences and policy thinkers, particularly here. There's some other conferences and organizations that do a lot of this work. My Data comes to mind, Trust over IP. There's people working on what sort of regulatory shifts, specifications, government approval of cryptography, trade agreements have to be modified because of the way data is cross-border. You know, that work has to happen too for large-scale adoption and large-scale investment. So paradoxically, I think even the people that want the least involvement of government recognize that until the government legalizes some of this stuff and clears the path for more investment, there won't be as quick of an adoption curve. So this sort of paradox, I think, or whatever paradox, generative tension between these two poles in the thinking and writing about decentralized identity creates a bit of semantic drift, as the CTOs say. Like, a lot of words mean very different things depending on where on the spectrum the speaker sits. So that's sort of a thing to look out for when you're first reading and mapping the space out for yourself, is where people fit, where people conceive of the separation of concerns between the state, the private sector, big companies, little companies, IP. I mean, a lot of this comes down to patents, the ugly word. Just for the sake of mentioning on each slide the links and the sourcing, the term legally enabled self-sovereign identity was, as far as I know, coined by Tim Boima, who often comes to these things, might be at this one, I haven't seen him yet. He works in the federal government of Canada on sort of IT planning, trust framework infrastructure, you know, legal agreements between contractors and such. And this whole slide actually was whole cloth plagiarized from Christopher Allen's pitch deck earlier this year at an event for the Odyssey Hackathon in Amsterdam, which has a whole SSI track, by the way, and a whole local government legally enabled self-sovereign identity track, coincidentally. So if you're into hackathons and accelerators and incubators, strongly recommend checking out the Odyssey stuff. Very cool. Christopher Allen and Tim Boima have both been very influential on the programming at this next Odyssey 2020. I said all that too quickly. I need to drink some water and take a breath. Karyl, relieve me of my duties.
Yep, that was awesome. So if you'll click to the next slide, now we're going to talk a little bit about where the technology is today in terms of digital identity and where we're going in terms of decentralized identity and the kinds of technologies that power the various futures that Juan was describing. So in particular, my company likes to think of identity as the gene of software applications. And this helps me because when we're talking to customers, we talk a lot about how you can't build any system without accounting for identity. But a lot of the solutions that we're using today, if you'll click to the next slide, are centralized. And what that actually means is that a single service provider is owning and controlling access rights to that data. So a good example of this are some of the big tech companies we're seeing in the news a lot lately, and some of the organizations that, well, in particular today, things like Facebook or Google. And so they are managing everything in a centralized format. The way the world for us today is also an extension of centralized identity, which is federated identity, which basically involves our solution today of bridging the various data silos of having countless centralized logins for all of your different accounts, whether that's Facebook, Pinterest, email, etc. We all have countless of them now. And so now you see these options often pop up where you can log in with Facebook or log in with your Google credentials. And so this basically makes things more convenient, but it actually just starts to amass more and more control into the hands of ultimately whichever centralized identity provider you're federating through. So the result is that today the use of centralized and federated identity powered by these centralized providers has us in a situation where we have a lot of problems. First of all, there's basically the data that's collected and used by these centralized providers is often used to create kind of detailed profiles of us that they're then able to capitalize on and provide kind of all or nothing access. So we've seen a lot of debates around this, particularly in the EU over the last few years with the advent of GDPR and this right to be forgotten, or the right to not just have all or nothing access with some of these providers. We also face the problem of who actually owns user data and decides how it's used. This is, again, something Juan mentioned varies by geography. So even things like not just the actual data, but copies of your data are thought of really differently by geography and are very difficult problems to manage or separate ourselves from with the existing centralized infrastructure. We also have a situation where users can't actually control the use of that data. So similar to the all or nothing access, we can't, even when we have rights, often the nature of these systems and business models are such that these controls and consents are either completely inaccessible or not very accessible at all in terms of users exercising control over that data. And then we have kind of the tactical, or rather the practical technical concerns. So these are honeypots. So as a centralized provider amasses more and more of your personal identifying data, the more data they have, the bigger target they are, and the more PII of yours that could be potentially leaked or used nefariously if and when there's a breach, which we know are rampant. And then finally, what we're seeing kind of in the enterprise sector is as new regulations around control and ownership of this data come online, we're noticing that businesses don't want that liability. So not all of them have nefarious business models, but they're taking in more data than they need, and they don't have really efficient ways of mitigating that risk and reducing that liability. And then finally, we have mentioned data silos. One of the other implications of this is that data isn't very portable today. So if we'll go to the next slide, one of the technologies in particular, kind of, I guess, one of the seminal technologies of the self-sovereign identity space is decentralized identifier technology. So we know, and there's kind of a wide spectrum of debates around whether or not, blockchain is the best way, or which decentralized ledger or distributed ledger is the right one. But we do know that they are the bleeding edge in term, and the best way currently to basically have identity that is self-publishing and self-controlling. So the ability to re-aggregate data under your individual control and ownership is enabled by decentralized identifier technology. We use these for a lot of different things, but that's the high level. In addition to decentralized identifiers, there's actually kind of a collection of technologies I mentioned at the beginning that power some of these self-sovereign features Juan was describing. So decentralized identifiers are based on distributed PKI, or public key cryptography infrastructure. And when you use them, you can use them in combination with some of these other technologies you see on the screen to build full applications. So some of the most popular ones that a lot of emerging standards have are being worked on today are verifiable credentials. I love that you added this line, Juan, around Tim Ruff's recent publishing on the shipping container, but the best analogy for this is kind of a literal shipping container for data. It's cryptographically verifiable because it's signed by decentralized identifiers, and it allows data to start to traverse really disparate or different contexts. It eliminates data silos in a really effective way. Resolvers, or kind of a mini DNS, are another one of these technologies. The universal resolver is probably the most popular instantiation of this, which Marcus's team at Danube Tech has put on, and DIF hosts one of those instances of the universal resolver. This is a critical piece of technology for driving adoption and making sure that we don't have to teach our grandmothers cryptography in order to actually use the technology. Secured data stores, or encrypted data vaults, is another name for this. So you can think of these very much as lockers, or a locker that is specially accessed by a decentralized identifier. So it's an additional layer of security. And this working group, it just spun up between the W3C and the W3C and the DIF. And so definitely get involved, because we are in the process of naming. And then
I was voting for the name Freehold. I think they should be called freeholds, which is the coolest thing. Michael Shea mentioned it the day we were talking about names. It might be confidential something. I don't know, but stay tuned. I guess.
I don't know if I like
freehold.
So I'm still into the encrypted data vault, but anyway, so yeah, that work. We'll point out at the end where you can get involved in some of the evolution of these specifications. There's obviously some of the really sexy bleeding edge cryptography, otherwise known as the zero knowledge proofs. These types of technologies help you prove things about yourself without disclosing or giving away any information, or very, very minimum data. So you can imagine the age-old example at this point is walking into a bar and being able to prove that you're more than 21 without them needing to know your eye color, your address, or any other number of things you disclosed today. And then finally, wallets or agents. And the universal wallet specification is something I know my team is working really hard on in the standards organizations, and this is something that's being rapidly defined as we speak. But wallets are the things that hold the various credentials associated with your decentralized identifier. Would you add anything else to this list, Juan?
I would only add that the wallet agent terminology is a little unstable, and earlier this year, the glossary group at DIF did a little research project getting people to explain where they saw the boundary between the two, and is an agent just a cloud wallet, or is it something with cloud native, the mental models of this. And it's gotten a little better over time, only because it's sort of harmonized within communities, but there's still a bit of flexibility there. So if you're new to the space and a little confused by what a cloud wallet is and why agent means something a little different every time a different person talks about it, it's not your fault. They're just sort of regional terms, dialects. And yeah, in the links at the end, we'll have some resources there if you want to read the report on semantic diversity around wallets and agents.
I would also add that when it comes to usability, the conversation around design patterns and how to educate users, it generally circles around wallets. So we found ways to, I think, elegantly abstract away some of the encryption, but wallets, pretty much our analog has been pioneered by Apple and Android at this point, thank goodness, but there's still, a lot of complexity around how to use digital wallets to hold other kinds of credentials. And then just kind of being a B2B company using some of this technology, we often think about agents as more of a souped up wallet or the ability to have agency or take actions based on the credentials or data living within. So that's a helpful distinction for me when I'm thinking about making sense of those terms. So I think we'll dive in a little bit deeper to what decentralized identifiers actually are and give you an example here on the right of what a DID document actually looks like. So these are URL-based unique identifiers that are, again, globally unique. They're resolvable with high availability, and they're always cryptographically verifiable. So basically, the DID document, what you see on the right-hand side is a document that describes the public keys, the authentication protocols, and the necessary service endpoints to basically have cryptographically verifiable interactions. And there's not just one DID method. So there's a variety of DID methods. There's well over 50 today. I think on the next slide, we have kind of an older list, but you can see on that link, the DID method registry so over 70. Thank you for doing the new count. And each of these methods has different trade-offs. Some of them are really practical technical trade-offs. Like for instance, my company uses SideTree, and one of our methods is in here called Element. It's implemented on Ethereum. And the primary reason we're using it is because of the scalability gains we get. It really allows for batch issuance of identifiers and solves a lot of scalability problems for our customers. However, there are other trade-offs and different methods that focus on some of the self-sovereign values Juan was mentioning, where they emphasize privacy or they may emphasize ownership, et cetera. I don't know if there's any one in particular you want to call out here, Juan.
Did Holo? Yeah, pretty cool. No, I mean, I'm not going to play favorites. I will say that the one DID method that a lot of people talk about is did un, and the name is a joke because it's going to undo or undid all the dids, according to some people. But I also want to say, as someone deeply involved in the Karyl project, that it is my firm opinion that it will not undo it will not wipe out these 70. It's not like these will have no reason to exist once there are fully functional, standardized Karyl implementations in common. I think DID methods are still very, very useful. And there's, I just came from another session about next generation DID methods and taking SideTree further and, this kind of stuff. It's not that DID methods are something that was like a stage and there's a stage after where we don't need them anymore. I think even it might undo the necessity of DID methods for a few use cases and add like 6 more use cases where that DID methods are still useful for. I think it's a DIDs are like TCP/IP. They're just the narrow waist here.
Yeah, I think if you're thinking about getting into the space and building applications that use decentralized identifier technologies, when you're choosing a method, it's helpful to assess the ones you see here based on why they were built. And because fortunately, we're still kind of at the front of our industry being created, almost all of the creators of these are here at this conference or very easily tracked down in the SDOs or on GitHub. But I just kind of looking at the list, I know Occam focuses on IoT identity, right? So their DID method likely has a lot of advantages for those types of applications. Why we at Transmute care about SideTree for our logistics customers is because they're often identifying assets and issuing lots of them at once, and they're very low margin commodities in some cases. And so we needed something really cost effective and scalable cared less so about some of the privacy preserving things, although their side tree definitely offers some of that. And so I think as you click around and get familiar, thinking through kind of what do you want to build and whether or not one of these methods has already been designed for a similar problem is a useful place to start.
And a lot of people just assume like, oh, we're starting an SSI company or an SSI project. Step one, invent a DID method. No, we already have like 79. There's probably one that does everything you need to do. There's probably versions of it on multiple blockchains. There's probably, you can track down ways to, yeah, there's a lot of mix and match possible with what's already here. Rolling your own is kind of like rolling your own blockchain. We have side chains now. You don't, not everyone needs a blockchain and a DID method for everything.
Yeah, and that's actually a good point. Some of these identity methods are blockchain specific, and some, the general instantiations are blockchain agnostic. So that's another consideration. So I think if we hop to the next slide, we wanted to dive a little bit different or a little bit more deeply into the second specification and technology that is, I think, farthest along in terms of being established in this space, which is verifiable credentials. So, and again, an example in code of what one of these looks like is sitting on your right. So a VC is basically just a set of claims that is tamper evident and comes with the ability to resolve a cryptographic proof about it so that you know with certainty what is being claimed is what was intended and that it was signed by a trusted party that you can also verify. So things that the industry is working on creating or transforming into verifiable credentials include things like any kind of identification card, a driver's license or a digital HR credential, such as an employee ID card or the right to be able to work in a certain location. Any sort of physical credential, there are definitely companies and individuals in the space pioneering creating verifiable versions out of them that can be held in a digital wallet. Other things that are becoming verifiable credentials that folks are focused on are basically paper that's today pushed around across a lot of different ecosystem players, whether this is in logistics, and we're talking about shipping documentation, where multiple actors need to sign off on something and also share that data in a verifiable way across their ecosystem. Those are other examples where verifiable credentials are being adopted.
I have a little anecdote to add there.
Cool.
Yes. What day is today? What is time? Time circle.
Yeah.
Yesterday
Tuesday.
I was in the VC, the Educational Verifiable Credentials Task Force meeting of the CCG, and the special guest was Leonard Rosenthal, who literally wrote the O'Reilly book on PDFs. He said something that blew my mind so much. I wasn't on mute and I went, whoa, and it interrupted everyone. It was very embarrassing. He said, VCs are just a signed envelope, and a PDF, a modern PDF, like a PDF since 2011 or whatever, is a signed envelope. You can put a VC in a PDF or a PDF in a VC, and it's, you know, if you're good at both, if you're really like a linked data guru and an RDF guru and a PDF guru, the two systems can interact, and PDFs are like 51% of the data in the world. Like everything is in PDF. Entire countries use fax machines and PDFs for everything. So getting one into the other is something a lot of people are working on. There's Karyl's CTO just wrote to the CCG mailing list thread about this today. Like there's some really interesting work there. And yeah, the Educational Verifiable Credentials group is another great resource for people. That group is really interesting because most of the projects involved there are using VCs without DIDs. There's a lot of projects that use DIDs without VCs and VCs without DIDs. So if you, like Karyl was saying, if you're doing research on this topic, if you really need a super complicated VC, go to the people that don't use DIDs and compare how they do it. And same with DIDs. If you need some super fancy DID, you need to read about Carry and Sidetree and all the like weird DID methods, because there's, yeah, this envelope's being pushed in 10 directions at once.
Yep. I love that anecdote.
Whoa!
And that's cool that you got to be in on that conversation. Yeah, so where these, I think if you click to the next slide, just kind of briefly, when used alone or together, there's a lot of advantages of using these technologies. And these, again, the Decentralized Identifier specification and the Verifiable Credential specification, I would say were the two first and kind of leading in terms of the evolution of these as standards. So you can find those in the W3C. So some of the advantages, including the ability to actually give users, or in the case of my business, manufacturers, ownership and control over their own data, identity data and IP data, as well as their credentials. There's far more options for data portability across different systems because of use of these. And then we have a really interesting situation where we can solve a lot of inefficiencies, but we can do so without pursuing consortium models and having to have everyone's buy-in in a lot of cases. So the increased business efficiency by using, for instance, verifiable credentials, being able to disclose and prove things about yourself without following an onboarding process every time you need to do that is really, really useful in a lot of B2B use cases. The streamlined auditing, honestly, automated auditing is worth a lot. So there's a lot of folks who the major selling proposition is in that sphere. And especially in the increasingly globally connected and also world where supply and demand is completely unpredictable right now, the streamlined auditing has become very, very interesting. And then, of course, the increase of trust and any sort of chain of custody. So one of our customers likes to say that trust is really just a data comparison. So trust is like the buzziest word in our space, but when you start to think about how can you infuse trust into an ecosystem using technology, we're generating immutable or verifiable data points that can be compared, right? So if everything that I was saying yesterday and today were, if I memorialize them using verifiable credentials, I couldn't lie tomorrow about what was happening. And so you could compare what I say tomorrow across time. And so that's one example, really oversimplified example of how trust can be increased using these technologies. And then the next slide, before I think I throw it back to you for resources, Juan, this is actually just one of the slides I use in our company for customers early on, which is more thinking through like, where is the relevance of this technology? What kinds of applications is it being deployed in today? And like, where is it being adopted most rapidly? So this is just a view of the three questions where if the answer to one of these is yes, one of, decentralized identifier technology, verifiable credentials, some of the other SSI stack, if you will, it could be really useful in solving these problems. Our company, and I think probably the organizations Juan's been working with over the last year, have focused in these purple areas. Although increasingly there's blends. So like healthcare, there's a pharmaceutical chain of custodies, right? So the supply chain kind of is pervasive or horizontal across these. And yes, DIF actually has kind of a special interest discussion group focused on healthcare now. So DIF is the foundation that focuses on incubating technical standards and doing some really bleeding edge technical discovery and testing. And we're starting to map that all the way up to the different use cases that each of our respective organizations are actually using these technologies in, and healthcare is one of the first. So definitely join that if you get a chance. And I think that's it for me. I think now you're going to share how we can get more involved.
I actually want to linger on this slide because I think this is useful to people on the business side. We talk a lot about the next slide is mostly tech education and figuring out the moving parts and the interoperability and the standards landscape. But I think for people in the front of house, as I like to call it, by restaurant analogy, the use cases like you say here on the previous slide, auditing is everything, and everyone these days, people never get sick of saying that data is a new oil, but oil has to be refined. How verifiable and how reliable each data point is, or what the net value of data is, varies a lot based on the quality of the data, and how directly it came to you. So a lot of verifiable credentials is about freezing data at its point of origin and cryptographically proving it hasn't been tampered with, which otherwise you might need a blockchain for, or some other very expensive proprietary siloed way of making data tamper-proof. So I really think that one by one, every industry is finding its use cases for this kind of auditing and forensics. There's document management companies, forensic accountants, tax evasion investigators, all sorts of people have. I pick those examples because they're fun. You know, I'm kind of obsessed with the Panama Papers, but a world without tax evasion is pretty cool if you like governments. I mean, and if you don't like governments, I don't know, maybe we can get more tax evasion. I don't know. Pick your poison. But yeah, the DIF is starting to make some discussion groups on the business side. There's a UX group led by Karyl's colleague Margot, which it's a product design group, but lately they've been talking a lot about UX. And that's a major resource for small companies, product owners, product designers, people doing research on real world deployments, particularly of consumer technologies, but really all use cases for any IT end up needing interfaces. And that I really feel like much more than 6 months ago is starting to cohere. There's a direction that the community is going in there. So definitely the DIF discussion groups are open to non-members. So as more of those come online, get involved if you're trying to move into a specific vertical or market. There's also tracks at Odyssey. I'm seeing some people in the audience here who are on an Odyssey team with me, doing prop tech, real estate use case in Odyssey. There's lots going on. Okay, sorry, enough of the front of house. Now let's go way to the back of the house, to the boiler room that powers the kitchen.
Yep. And this is getting a lot more complicated as we speak, but this is just kind of the uber zoomed out high level of view of the kinds of organizations you should seek out depending on what your interest is in and kind of what they're focused on. I actually think the next slide with the map and all the links, the drilled down version, is even more useful, which you can find at the link at the bottom. And again, we'll share this. But Juan created this for DIF if you want to talk through it. But I've shared this with lots of folks at this point. It's super useful.
Well, actually, I should say Reuven Heck, executive director of DIF, made a version of this that was 90% of this, almost as detailed. I just went through and made links and added the section at the bottom, which includes trust over IP, which didn't exist when we made this slide. Sorry, I didn't update this slide. This slide does include trust over IP. And so the 3 columns here are what used to be called the 3 stacks. And I think there's been a lot of, like maybe a year ago, 2 years ago, it made sense to talk about the CCG group that was really head-to-toe linked data, really deep web standards oriented group, had what at the time looked like a coherent stack. Hyperledger was completely indie based, and DIF at the time was sort of independent from both, associated with the vanilla JSON, JOTS, and some other technologies. And over time, this stack has sort of melted, right? Like the so many joint projects and interoperability and using each other's libraries have made this more of a grid and less of 3 stacks. So the DIF has these joint working groups. There's also some sort of work items that have a lot of people from multiple communities that were deliberately working together so that both communities could use the thing. So I think the these three slides, these three, rows have to do with the anchoring layer, agent layer, and credential layer, more or less. These are the first three of the four stacks in the trust over IP mental model, which is sort of a division of labor between trust over IP, Aries, and Indy. And as you can see, Indy, Aries, and then trust over IP would be up here in the sort of use case trust framework, real world. And yeah, the interoperability working group with Kaliya Young, co-founder of this conference, and Pam Dingle from Microsoft, formerly chaired by Karyl, CTO, is made an expanded version of this that is like a poster, like it doesn't even fit on an 8.5 by 11. And I'll show you that at the end. But yeah, this is sort of a, I want to keep emphasizing and beating this dead horse. This is like a 2 years out of date conception of the space. And yeah, these are resources, places to read, places to self-educate. I think the most important link on this whole thing is up here, which is the link I'm going to show you after we're done with pitch deck time. But yeah, these are all self-explanatory resources.
Yeah, and the slide before this, really both of these, this is meant to be living. We'll update it, I guess, every 6 months with IIW, but we did not have a map like this when we entered the space. It's super, super useful. And even just, yeah, to help, depending on what you're building, the ability to know where to go and where the other people building it are super useful. I think, especially in the industry's infancy, getting to actually work alongside and with the people who are pioneering building these things is super, super useful. It has been for our company, but I wish we'd had this map at the beginning.
and it's also like about proximity, right? I made this sort of spatial when I was editing Reuven's version. I moved things like up, down, left, right, based on how specific they are to the stack versus how useful they might be to someone over here. Like, a lot of the companies that made these specs and working on these projects use this stuff that's on the right side over here. And if you're using Aries stuff, if you're building head to toe Aries, obviously, this is the place to look. But if you're trying to figure out what the equivalent is, how you interoperate with someone who's totally outside the Aries stack, this can be really useful to see the equivalences. That was how I tried to spatialize this stuff. Yes, and this might sound trite, but if you're new to the space and your short and medium term job success hinge to some degree on immersing yourself in this world, podcasts are great. Like, follow people on Medium, follow people on Twitter, listen to Kaliya's podcast, listen to Alex's podcast, definitely Identity. Tim Boma's podcast is great. The One World Identity people have this like interview series that's kind of like the Verge cast for identity, both decentralized and conventional. There's a lot of great stuff out there. There's kind of, yeah, it's fractal. You keep zooming in and finding out more new stuff that you don't know yet. Anything else to add on?
Do you have any questions so far? Not on this one. I think, yeah, I'll post it on LinkedIn right after this. We'll have the recording and the notes, but I'm curious if there's any questions as well, because I know we've been talking a lot.
Yeah,
I don't see any hands, so. And I recognize enough names that this is definitely not their first rodeo. They've seen a bunch of 101s, I think.
Feel free to ask questions that you are asking for a friend.
Yeah. And you're in good hands. we're basically the 5-year-olds of the industry. So.
Hi, this is Sasha. In that case, I'll take a question or provide a question. So when we talk about decentralized, I wonder what role can mobile devices play on that? Because I wonder if I have all my data on my phone only, I think it cannot be more decentralized than that. And this is all about a decentralized network, right? But is a personal device part of that in your vision, or not at all?
It certainly can be. So the short answer goes back to that it depends on the application. And some of those DID methods are specific to implementing on personal devices and are focused on those types of use cases. And I'm aware of a lot of applications where they're approaching things with that in mind. There are also others that are not focused on that. And so I think it's similar to DIDs are not, they're not necessary to create a verifiable credential, but you can create verifiable credentials with them. Similarly, kind of edge or on your own personal device, owning and controlling your data there, you can use these technologies to power what you're describing, but in a lot of cases, we're using them to power completely different things. I don't know if that it depends answer. Yeah, go ahead, Juan.
I would my instinct is to answer very cynically and say, is a self-sovereignty predicated on an Android or iOS phone an oxymoron? Like until we have Purism phone or Clear phone or one of these mainstream alternate app market, alternate iOS, I think the mobile phone is self-sovereign in a very compromised way. I think there's so much ad tech and tracking built into the phone. I mean, I'm maybe channeling or sucking up to some of the people I see in the audience that have been fighting the duopoly of cell phone operating systems for a long time. And you know, within the community, there's really a wide diversity. There's people that want to do everything in the browser because the browser is the closest we have to a neutral venue. There's people who want to completely circumvent the browser and instead end up relying a lot on like mobile operating systems and cloud vendors. There are people really obsessed with cloud sovereignty and data sovereignty who want like a hardline open source, like no big tech solution, and there's room for all of them in the tent, I think. I mean, a VC is just decentralized data, and a DID is a decentralized identifier, and they're two tools with pros and cons in every use case, and many different ways to implement both. So it depends what kind of data it is and what kind of individual or self-sovereign control you're going for, honestly. That's a non-answer, but
yeah, but it's not out of the world, right?
No. On the contrary, some of the most interesting DID methods are very mobile. I like to call them mobile secessionist because it's like I keep the keys on my device, I do the cold storage, and all the data sort of ultimately I have ultimate control over, thanks to biometrics on my device or biometric enrollment. That's asymmetrical, so it stays on device. That's pretty cool. And there's, you know, like YOLOCOM is one of the trailblazers there that have a really all-in-one sort of solution for that. And yeah, I think it's all based on use case. I could also provide sort of equally enterprisey solutions that use all the same technologies. There's really a lot of diversity. But like as with everything else, something I'm trying to do at DIF in the coming months is set up like office hours, like open time slot to to try to pick my brain about this. So I'm always happy to like tell you which 5 names come to mind with any use case or set of parameters or goals. Also, actually, one interesting thing you might be interested in, there was a session earlier today on the Rebase project, which is a weird self-sovereign version of Keybase, which I think is a pretty interesting way to build self-sovereignty within a really within I would say in the belly of the data barons, behind enemy lines in Twitter country and GitHub country. So it's something to look into if you're looking at that kind of individual control stuff.
Thank you.
Hi, Juan. This is David Luchuk from Trust Over IP. First time listener, first time caller. I was wondering if we can be agreed that the business model by which we sort of accept that consumers are going to surrender their data and personal information to be commercialized by the organizations that capture that information and trade it for access to services. Like, if we assume that's not going to be the model of the new world, in this set of conversations that are going on and exchanges and podcasts and content and discussions, is there an emerging alternative business model to that? I know people who basically tell me, so long as I can access my fantasy football site, I don't care what they do with my data. And it keeps me up a little bit at night thinking how a functioning business model in the consumer citizen space is going to emerge, where we can't count on everybody caring that the sovereignty of their data is not necessarily self at the moment.
I don't mean to call on someone who might be on mute because they're in the other room making a coffee or something, but Johannes had a session about this earlier today. Last IIW, Riley Hughes from Trinsic and had a business model session. I think he might be having another one tomorrow. He's unmuted. He might have thoughts on the subject, Johannes.
Your guess was good, but not entirely correct. I wasn't brewing coffee. I was taking care of the dog. But other than that, so, I mean, this is sort of this entire spectrum of questions is sort of the big elephant in the room. And every year the elephant gets bigger and the room gets a little more squeezed, I have the impression. And but one thing that is new is that unlike 2 or 3 years ago, I think it is now becoming common knowledge that we have a problem. It's not just us strange geeks in the privacy part. I mean, today I'm reading that the Department of Justice and the US has filed antitrust suit against Google. This is all part of the same sort of spectrum. But what we now need to do, and it falls to us in this community and other communities who have the position and the ability to do so, is actually build an alternative. Because we can sit here all day long and say it's all terrible, unless we have something that actually works similarly well. We should shut up because we have nothing to propose. And so what I'm trying to do with the session that was just mentioned is just to start a conversation as to how does this look like? Let's make it specific. Not generalities, but specifically who builds which product that will do that, and how is this going to compete with the equivalent thing in the surveillance capitalism market?
Johannes, can you remind me what that session is going to be called? I remember I looked for it.
I still have my announcements.
That's right. I forgot. Right. Rolling back, sir. That's right. Okay. Thank you. And thank you for indulging this question, Juan. I appreciate it.
No. And I also want to plug another podcast I love called This Machine Kills. It's done by an academic and a tech reporter talking about basically geopolitics and materialist analysis of the tech industry. It's pretty great. It's weekly. They're 2 hours long each time. And that one really slaps. And just in terms of business models, I think I always say in an SSI context, particularly when I'm talking to fellow North Americans, that GDPR, in my opinion, I see it not as a punitive, backwards-looking, ill-conceived attempt to clamp down on the data barons. I see it as a distraction technique. It is a way to put the data barons on their back foot for a few years and create a space for new models to emerge. I think my experience of Brussels and of the European Commission, the Next Generation Internet Program, the ESIF Lab program that multiple people in this audience are participating in, is very much an incubator, accelerator, I don't know what the terminology is, a funding program, SVIP in the US, the Canadian program working on wallets right now. They're all trying to foment and support the creation of alternate business models that make consented data valuable, tradable. I think everyone who works, like I said, data's the new oil and you have to refine it. And the purest, like the top shelf, primo, uncut, best data in the world is zero-party consented data, straight from the source. Hasn't passed through dirty hands. Like that's the top shelf data. So the target is in sight. There are people, salivating for that good data, and it's just about how quickly we can create alternate pipes to get them data that has consent receipts attached, and data that is, like certified organic, straight from the source, traceable. A lot of the use cases I've had the pleasure to work on in the last year with a lot of companies I advised, like Severity being the most, the bulk of those use cases I was working on, are basically data provenance use cases. So it isn't just proving that the data has been untampered. It's like showing who had the data at each point in time. It's sort of like traceability for data is a whole thing. And that's the kind of business model that I think is a good place to start. Medical companies, research, any sort of research where not just the authenticity of the data, but who has seen it, it matters. Those are interesting use cases where the business model seems achievable in the short term. Those are the low-hanging use cases. I think I tend to be a cynic about direct-to-consumer use cases, except only because the Silicon Valley model, the California ideology is like scale, borrow indefinitely, live off stock price until you have 1 billion people using your stuff and then do whatever you want with them. I think that's a pretty hard model to compete with without 1,000 GDPRs blooming. But there's plenty of data quality use cases that don't really need as much supporting firepower.
Thanks, Juan.
I also actually think a lot of solutions in the space are folks using the technology today. Their solutions either power the slide you showed at the beginning, Juan, the kind of minimum trust versus less identity.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are certain products, this is certainly the class of product Transmute my company is in, where it allows customers to start to explore business models in both of those spheres if they so choose. So I think someone commented, kind of let the market decide on the business model, and there's definitely some amount of that mentality in as we solution. We're technologists, and so working with customers to understand what they come up with as well as they use these new solutions, and what kinds of business models make sense based on their market or their industry, I think is going to be really, really important. Because the fact of the matter is, especially in the B2B space, we don't have like KPIs or good ways to measure things like better supplier reputations, or, you know, we can measure the efficiency of onboarding a new vendor. But what happens when we've been using a system that's based on SSI tech for 5 years or 10 years? What are those business models? And I think that's one of the most exciting things that we'll end up discovering together.
Yeah.
So I had a little bit of a question around, sorry, there I am. I'm Jeff. I'm pretty new to this whole space, and as you can see there, I work at Kiva. As I said, I'm pretty new to all this, and one of the things that sort of drew me into this just a couple of months ago was this promise of inclusion, being able to include, you know, there's like billions of people who don't have an identity in the world, and I've heard a lot of this talk around business use cases and getting away from, you know, Google and Facebook and those guys who manage massive amounts of identity. But I'm curious if there's any part of this ecosystem that's looking more at these sort of greenfield spaces as opposed to this combative approach against like the big Silicon Valley names. Very obviously personally interested in that. But.
I think you're hitting the nail on the head. I think a lot of us got into this space envisioning very individual personal values around ownership and privacy and control. And in particular, a lot of the early applications and a lot of applications still doing well and doing work largely in the developing world in the B2C space in terms of enabling access to identity and control over your data in spaces where there isn't a really developed federal or state kind of entities managing identity is certainly the case. I think what you're hearing, especially from me, coming from the frame of being based in Texas, working in the United States, our conception around personal or individual privacy is very different than, say, Europe or even parts of Africa or Asia. And so they're just kind of for better or for worse, the really capitalist focused mindset of a lot of, you know, all the business in America leads you down a path of trying to figure out where the low-hanging fruit is in terms of like what kinds of problems can you solve in a B2B space to start to insert this kind of more empowered infrastructure into the world and into the business world in the States. But certainly Juan being in Berlin and probably a lot of others on this call in other geographies can add color to what's being done to enable persons with more in more vulnerable situations or in the developing world in terms of enhanced control over their identities. That just for us we could not find a model or an application of the technology in that format here in the States. So you're definitely hearing that in my framing for sure.
I mean, in terms of finding a venue for discussing it, I think there are, in terms of people you might want to talk to or places you might want to go, DIF has an APAC, Asia Pacific discussion group open to non-members, non-IPR protected monthly. I believe an Africa one is spinning up soon. If anyone is on the call that wants to unmute themselves and talk about it that is involved, please do, but I'm not at all involved in it. There is also, you know, one of my colleagues at DIF is his name is Balash Nemeti, and he has a company called Talkanu that has been working on some of the problem areas and looking at international aid use cases. And I think with international, I mean, there's also actually an interesting data quality project that has nothing to do with SSI, but is an interesting inroad to this called Roots, Roots with a G in front of it. They do a lot of stuff doing data quality on international aid projects. And I think just speaking more generally, identity. One of me and Katrie's mentors in a earlier project, we were paired up with this sort of startup mentor who told us identity and payments are always two sides of the same coin, right? People who don't have an identity are people who can run away from debts. So giving identity to people whose economic life is mostly informal is not that different from putting a target on their back in the worst case scenario, right? So I think the best ways of thinking of identity for the unidentified is to think about whether or not the use case is one where the costs are outweighed by the benefits, right? I mean, giving a financial identity to someone who is sort of loosely or undocumented has a lot of political and economic consequences, mostly good, but sometimes bad. So one of the interesting things that Balázs told me from his research on identifying the previously unidentified is that the projects that tend to have the most success are the ones where the identity infrastructure is operated by the most neutral and trustable party possible, like UNHCR, some sort of international aid org that's very, very ethically bound and transparently governed, that deletes their servers every 5 years, kind of thing. Because if you create an identity and you have the wrong governance for that infrastructure, a bank buys the company that operates the infrastructure, and all of a sudden you've created a payday loan machine. Like I tend to be very cynical about let's give these people identity projects, because I think, coming from Latin America, being Argentinian myself, I've known plenty of people who don't want an identity and would have to be pretty hungry to accept one if it was the condition of free sandwich. But that's, again, of course.
If I could jump in, Juan, Kiva already being a member of the Trust Over IP Foundation, it's actually a very easy, for me anyway, intervention to make just to say that we have what we call right now our human trafficking task force, which, through some of my relationships in a previous life, I intend to bring the United Nations High Commission and the International Organization for Migration into that set of conversations. And the question that Juan raised about when is it a good idea versus when is it actually detrimental to a person to have this sort of identity imposed on them is an important question in that conversation. But I would suggest that just by direct answer to this question, that I would earnestly suggest that Kiva become involved in the Trust Over IP Human Trafficking Task Force as a way of entering into and sort of kind of pushing this conversation in our organization, because I think this is a conversation that needs to take up more space in terms of what we're doing, and more generally in this community of people. That question of who's included and how does it benefit someone to become included in this SSI conversation is important. And speaking only for ourselves, the space to most immediately jump into for us is that we have a task force that's looking at the question of human trafficking and what identity means in that space. And I think it would be cool to have Kiva play a very active role in that. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. Yeah, feel free to send me a message afterwards or something.
Super.
Awesome. Well, Juan, I think we're at time technically, so I
do want to plug an ongoing project. So the interoperability working group at DIF, also open to non-members, also non-IPR protected, alternating meeting times every other week. It's in a different, at a drastically different time to accommodate time zones globally. this interoperability is a bit of a misnomer at the moment, because at the moment, sort of listening to the needs of the people that have been participating, we got the sense that a lot of interoperability boils down to education. Asking people to interoperate with technologies they know nothing about is kind of like saying, well, they can interoperate with me. I don't know their stuff. Maybe they know my stuff. So we've been doing a lot of educational stuff, guest speakers. We're going to be recording guest speakers and putting them on YouTube to make a sort of library of educational stuff to help people bridge technical divides and understand each other's styles and aesthetics of and you know, these are intellectual histories. These are whole ways of seeing data that have to be sort of bridged. TOIP has interoperability work as well that works backwards from use cases. These are sort of working forward from, or I don't know, down or up on the previous diagrams. So yeah, we have a lot of ongoing stuff. We send out a lot of surveys and try to get invitations to come speak. So if you get an email from me with interoperability in the title, I'm probably asking you to come give a 5-minute lecture for the YouTube series. And right now we have an ongoing project this week. If you are, so we're trying to just fill out a matrix. Which kinds of VCs does each wallet hold and present? Seems like a simple question. And yet no one could answer for anyone else's wallet. People hesitated, didn't know, put a question mark after it if they thought they knew. So we're asking people to go into this unlocked HackMD and update the row of the wallet they work on. So if you work on a wallet, if you're here for educational purposes, maybe you're a junior member of a team working on a wallet, but hopefully this is a high enough level question that anyone working on a wallet should be able to fill this out. So yeah, find your row or add your row if I've missed you. Apologies. This link, I'll put it in the chatty chat. Yeah.
And lastly, I just want to thank whoever has been taking notes. That's awesome and super helpful to speakers. We'll, right after this upload, the video of the call, as well as the deck that we shared. We'll put a link in the notes as well, so you can actually click around everything. And if you're interested, demo hours coming up in 10 minutes. I know several folks on this call, as well as myself, have company demos set up. So please interact. We want the feedback.
Just a quick question, please.
Mm-hmm. Of course.
Yeah, you mentioned, I don't know if it's a ongoing research or a paper that has been released, where you say you talked about the previously unidentified, identifying the previously unidentified or something?
Yeah, yeah.
So can you give us more specifics about that, please?
That was, let me see. That might have been Apocrypha. That was, I'm trying to remember. This was actually a long time ago. This is not one of the recent projects. This was, where was that? Well, it's definitely a UN project. It wasn't one of the ID 2020 ones. I think it was a microcurrency project somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa. It's escaping me. I'll ask Balázs, but I think Balázs might be attending the kickoff call of the DIF African members and companies considering joining call. Or he's pretty accessible, Balázs at Identity Foundation. I think that.
By the way, I'm from sub-Saharan Africa.
No, I'm familiar with the work. I'm familiar with the work. Thank you so much for coming. But yeah, I think the my go-tos for that kind of research, like the what's it called? The digital governance. the name's escaping me. There's a lot of nonprofits that, the headliners at RightsCon that publish these reports. They're pretty good. The one I'm thinking of is based in the UK. It's got governance in the title, but it's a really long name and I'm spacing on it. Sorry. Unfortunately, this is recorded, so my ignorance is immortalized, but it'll come to me. I'll message you somehow. Yeah, sorry to be drawing a blank. It's after midnight here, as maybe it is if you're in sub-Saharan Africa at the moment.
Awesome. Well, thanks everyone who joined. And yep, we hope that you enjoy the rest of your IIW. And thank you, Juan. Always a pleasure.
You bet.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye, guys.
everybody. Spam me later.